Pat France moved into this Dunedin house in 1968 when she was 57. I met her for the first time 10 years later when she was having her first exhibition of paintings in a show with Anna Kasselberg. I remember the occasion vividly. Pat, anxious and reticent among the crowd at the opening in the old manse of Knox Church, not long before it was demolished. Since that time, Pat and I have become close friends. I soon discovered that she's a remarkable and highly individual painter. She's lived in Dunedin for nearly 30 years, but was born in Taranaki.
My father was an Englishman, and he married my mother in Stratford, which is a little town in Taranaki, and then we went to live in Whanganui until I was about 5. And all my relations, a lot of them had lived there. And then finally they got tired of that, and my father wanted to live in Nelson where there were a lot of English people, so we went to Nelson, where I went to the Nelson Girls' College. And we lived every year or two, and he died there, and it was very sad. And, and then we went to live with my grandmother and my aunt up to Auckland. Yes. Where all the brothers and sisters were.
So the Taranaki time, is that vivid in your memory? What about your relatives?
Well, I knew that my grandmother, at a year old, came out in the first ship, the second ship, the Amelia Thompson, to New Plymouth from Devonshire. And she was my grandmother, and my grandfather was a Cornish man, and he came in the 60s from Cornwall. He was a Methodist, to escape religious persecution in England. And they met, and I think my grandmother was very young, and they married and went to live on a mission farm just out of New Plymouth. And there they had 3 or 4 children. And then he decided that he would take up land down at Carcramere. In those days, he was the first person to take land up down there, which is near Partia. And so they went down in a cart drawn by horses. And my mother was always, my grandmother was always very conscious that they should think that it wasn't cattle, because it was horses, and she thought that was, much more sort of the thing. And the Maoris came when they were halfway around, and they had a little boy called Theo and 3 little girls. And the Maoris came, and they was never seen a white baby boy, and they took the baby boy away. And my grandfather, who was very calm always, he said, "It'll be all right, they'll bring Theo back." And so they did. They brought the baby back in the evening, and then they went on down to Carcramere, where they had a farm and where the land was very good. It was beautiful land down there.
Did you have much to do with your aunts and uncles and grandparents? Were you a close family at all?
Yes, when I went finally to live in Whanganui, there were my uncle was the minister in the parliament, and the others were farmers, and the others, by that time, they were lawyers and various ones, and they all came a lot. The Whanganui Collegiate School was then built and, going strong, and we lived there.
Do you have any brothers and sisters yourself?
No, my mother was quite old when they got married, and my father was old too. I don't think they expected to have any. Because he'd been sent out from England, I think, to make his fortune. He was a public school boy, and had a lot of relations who were professors and things like that. And he met my mother and got married. And I don't think they ever expected any children.
Did he come to feel fully at home and accepted in New Zealand?
I think he liked very much having my mother's sisters and brothers, and he was happy to think that he got some photos of him looking very happy. He rode a bicycle. And but I think as time went on, he got very, very lonely, and we went to Nelson because there were English people there. And I think all those English people who came out did feel like that very often.
Being an only child, how do you think that affected you?
I had quite a lonely time always.
And moving around, did that contribute to that?
I was always rather lonely. When we got to Auckland, I quite liked it in Auckland because I went to the diocesan girls' school, and we had a big house, a near government house, and this is really rather strange. There was a Maori pa at the bottom of Constitution Hill in those days, and the road went right up to Parnell. But there was a big football field up there, which is now tennis courts and that, and I had great fun always. There were 2 staircases in this tall house, and we could look down on the Maoris, and not only Maoris, but everybody who went to the football field, and they all had a good lot to drink, and they all had to get up this hill, zigzag hill. My favourite occupation on Saturday afternoon was watching to see whether they'd get up the hill. And there was a Maori pa behind, and at least way down at the bottom. You know, it was very early days.
Pat was only 15 when she matriculated from Wanganui Girls' College in 1926. She thought of going to university and becoming a doctor, but her mother and aunt had other ideas. So, in 1927, when Pat was 16, she accompanied her mother and aunt on a trip to Europe. During 2.5 years in Europe, Pat went to the New York School of Interior Design in Paris, where she studied architectural drawing, life drawing, and painting. She also travelled extensively through Italy, Sicily, France, Germany, and England. She kept a diary of her trip, including the voyage to Europe on the Largs Bay.
And it was crowded, but there was never much food. And when we came to a port, the great thing was to get things to eat. And nearly all the ports that I remember, poached eggs in Malta, you know, I can remember all these various things. But in the Largs Bay, I had a lovely time, really. We stayed at Hobart for 3 days, and it was all flowers and food. And then we went to Perth. I remember that well. And finally, we went to Colombo, to Sicily, where I wore my best dress, and we went to lunch at the Goldface.
Where did your mother's income come from then?
She had a little bit of money from my papa and a little bit of money from her farming father. We had very little money, but my aunt had the same little bit of money. They put it together, and we managed.
And you went to London, and then you found out about the school in Paris. Now, what was the name of that?
The school in Paris was most interesting because it was the New York School of Interior Decorating, and it had only been it was the first school of interior decorating, the New York School, and it had only been going for about 3 years. And because the Americans were so keen on Paris, it was the centre of their world, they founded a branch in Paris. And at that time, Paris was the leading place of all the famous artists, you know, all wanting to go to America, really, and nearly all having been had a terrible time with the Russian Revolution. And so when I went to school, we managed to find out about this pension in Versailles, and we lived with Mademoiselle Venel and Cretel, and they had a finishing school in Arras, and that during the war, of course, which wasn't very long before, had been finished, and they had to move to Paris, and they had this lovely house in a boulevard leading up to the chateau. And there they took in a few guests. And there was Marie, who was the cook, and Armand, who was the garçon. And it was a lovely place. There was a gate and a paved courtyard and an elm tree in the middle with a seat round it. And the gate was always closed. And the place was, I suppose it was about, or several centuries old, was beautifully furnished. There was a Louis XVI and 15th room.
Did you have your own room, or did you share?
I had a room with my mother, and my aunt had a room. And we never had any baths or anything like that, because Armand, mother once turned on the bath when she got there to have a bath, and it was above the kitchen. And of course it all flooded, wasn't meant to be used. Went down into the kitchen to Marie, and I can remember how she came tearing out and said, "Ah, madame, you know, and we're not allowed to use the bathroom because early in the mornings, Armand came on with a big white apron, and there was a washstand with a jug and a bowl, and he filled it with warm water, and it was the only wash we ever had."
So you spent some money on perfume and scent, or what?
Well, I was only very young, didn't seem to matter terribly, but we did have a bit of scent, I think.
How old were you then?
I was 16.
16.
16 and 17.
What was the mood of Paris like then?
Oh, it was very exciting, actually, but we were very, very, we were so terribly, you know, from away at the bottom of the world, not terribly, weren't smart at all. Very provincial and from way down here. So we didn't really take part in anything very much, but we had a very nice time living with Mademoiselle. There were various people there.
Did your mother and aunt not feel that some young Frenchman might whisk you away?
I don't think they had any ideas of that sort at all. I was under their thumb completely. We went everywhere, we did everything together. It was just a little thing like that. And I did occasionally have a little adventures, but not much. And then we went...
Yes. What recollections have you got of such adventures?
Oh, well, I just say I can't remember, shall I?
I think it's your privilege.
And then as time went on, after a while of living this year, my aunt, but it was really a very exciting time because we went to in this school with architecture, and we went all the time to places, to the palaces and to the, you know, all the wonderful cathedrals and everything.
On their return to New Zealand, Pat's mother bought a home in Auckland on Remuera Road.
We borrowed the money from the Amalgamated Brick and Pipe Company. I can remember quite well. We borrowed £1,000. And that was a lot to borrow. It was my mother, we didn't have any money much. And we borrowed it from the Amalgamated, my uncles backed them, and we put up this little house. It was brick. It was right under Mount Hobson on the Remuera Road, and that little narrow section going down. And it was next door to some people, Miss Workman and then the Flemings, who had a big house. And it was in a fashionable part of Remuera. And but it was a big struggle to lay out the garden. The garden was on a hill, and we had no money, but we managed somehow. Did you get interested in gardening from that time on? I always loved the gardening, yeah. My father gardened. And did your mother as well? My mother loved gardening. It was a big thing, just like here. So, did you start work then? Did you have a job that you went to? And that was the whole point. I was never allowed to work. In my day, and with those people that I was brought up with, women didn't work. And if you did do any work, you had to keep it quiet. And I longed to work. And at one stage, I was going to start a restaurant, cafe, with Marjorie Mappin. But we were not allowed to. Did your mother scuttle those plans? Oh yes, none of it was allowed. And the only thing I could ever do was I used to embroider and make underclothes and sew for a girl I knew who had a place. But not allowed to do anything. But I did make a few table mats and things. Did you have a circle of friends? Yes, had a lot of friends because the family all were quite well off. They were all lawyers and one thing and another by this time. And then what you might call done well. They were all kind of like that. Whose family? I mean, which people? My mother's family, and all my English family was all in England. They were all in Ireland. So through the 1930s then, you were largely at home with your mother in Remuera? Yes, and nearly all the time I was looking after my aunt and my aunts. One of them was very sick. Her husband had departed, and we had to look after her. I was nearly always doing a lot of things like that. But I also went to dances, played bridge, played tennis, kept up, made clothes, had to cope with all these rich people. What happened when the war came out? When the war came out, I went straight away to Ellerslie to nurse, and that was for about 3.5 years, and we nursed there, and the whole of the kiosk, the big kiosk, was all a huge ward with 32 in it. We had a sister, and there were only 2 VADs. We had to look after them all. And they were all the soldiers. There were 600. And at one stage, I think there were 16, nearly 2,000 came into those Ellerslie racecourse. It was all wards of soldiers. And the member stand was all, and the tea kiosk, and the bars, everything was for the soldiers. And when there was, but they had the race days, and when the race days came, the next day, the soldiers, of course, went all in their dressing gowns to pick up the tickets to see if they could make some money. And they did nearly always make a bit of money. And then there were Americans everywhere.
Were these soldiers returned to New Zealand for recuperation, or
Quite a lot of them. There were there was a ward under the big ward where I was most of the time, was all black people. They were all shell-shocked, and they'd all been in the Coral Sea in the battles. And they were in this huge ward, and they were all very shell-shocked and very miserable. It was terrible. And we were always very sorry for them. And they used to walk along to the old man at the end who kept a wood thing going to heat the things, because they felt cold all the time, and they were always catching themselves on fire. And it was very primitive, all of that. Underneath the grandstand at Ellerslie, the main grandstand, there were duckboards that led from one end to the other, and up at the top where they sat went down to nothing. But there were rats, of course, all over this. It was sandy and rats. So on the way down on the duckboards, the soldiers all had cages with rats in them, and they used to have rat fights. It was their great thing, you know.
So they bet on those, did
yes,
they?
something to do.
So the Americans had quite a good time in New Zealand.
They had a lovely time all through New Zealand, Wellington and Auckland, and there were what they call Mob 4 and Mob 6, moving hospitals, and there were famous doctors who afterwards wrote books, and you know, and most of the people and all the girls had a good time, and we had silk stockings. And
Did you find American males appealing yourself? Or?
well, 1 or 2 were very nice. Yes, I knew 1 or 2. One came from Florida, and they were very nice. They were more light-hearted.
What happened after the war?
Everything was rather difficult then, because we had very little money, and my mother started to get very sick, and I had to look after everybody, and that was a difficult time.
Did you paint or draw at all in those days?
Hardly at all. I made table mats to try and sell things. One thing during the war, I was allowed to make things to sell, because that was all right, it was for the war effort. So I used to make table mats and things like that, but never on wastepaper baskets and all that. But I was never allowed to do anything. You know, you just didn't.
Did you feel there was a particular role for women to fulfill, and did it strike you that they were bound to behave in a certain way?
Not in those days. That came a bit, you know, afterwards. It wasn't really that, no. But it was very difficult after the war, and that it was really just because all the men had been away and then came back, and it was adjustment and difficult.
Now, when your mother died, what year was that then?
It was about 1959.
1959.
57 or 59.
Yes.
And then after that, my aunt came up to stay, and her husband had died. And so we used to go down to stay with her in Manatee, down in the car. I used to go down. That was nice, going down there. And then she came, and she was sick, and I looked after her for a while. And then I was always looked after my Aunt Rose, who had a very sad time. And then finally, you know, it was all up and down. And then my dear cousin Darry died. That's Peter's father, the stock exchange one.
Peter Paulson.
Yes, and he was a darling, lived along the road. And everyone had died, and then I got sick.
And that's when you came to Dunedin, is that right?
And then I came to Dunedin, and then the house was still there, you see, and I didn't seem able to cope. And so, and it really was largely living a life of none of it was really very normal or honest, really. Having to keep up all the time. All the people I knew were so rich, it was awful. Anyway, then I came down to Dunedin, and there I stayed for all that time.
When you got sick, you spent some time in Ashburn Hall.
I spent years in Ashburn Hall, and after I left Ashburn Hall, I bought this house, and I still went to Ashburn Hall for 2 years to cook. I went every morning to cook.
But yes, you think your period there was a really, well, to use the old phrase, I mean, it really changed your life, do you think, that whole period there?
Oh, well, yeah, of course, I was completely different. I went to Dr. Denford for years and years. I was completely changed. I wasn't the same person at all. Well, I wasn't in a way, but it gave me a whole new thing. It was quite different.
When you say it gave you a whole new thing, can you explain that a bit more?
Well, I had a long time when I was very depressed, of course. It was very with great depression and sadnesses, and but I learned to know myself, I think, and also I learned to paint.
You met a number of other people there at that time.
And I met Rodney, and that was a great.
Who was Rodney, and how did that?
Rodney Kennedy. Well, he's well-known man here who's died a few years ago, but he was more or less one of the big art people who collected and gave to the museums and art galleries.
For you as a North Islander, did you find it hard initially to adjust to coming down and living here?
Oh, it was so queer, being in Ashburn Hall for so long, and then finally getting this house and going on cooking there. But nearly all the people I knew were people in Auckland, of course, but I got to know some people around here, and Barbara. And
The art, the painting.
and I got, of course, to know Ralph. I knew Ralph and Jeffrey and all the artists.
Now, when you say Ralph and Jeffrey, you're talking about Ralph?
Ralph Hotry and Jeffrey Harris.
Yes.
They were great friends of mine, and they were Francis Hodgkin's fellows. I got to know all the fellows in the art world, and that was a wonderful interest. And then I started to collect and buy paintings.
Tell me about the painting and which painters you feel a kinship with and which you feel have influenced what you've painted yourself.
I felt very, very much for Colin all the time, and tried often to go to do the things that Colin did. Colin McCann.
Colin McCann. Did you know him personally?
Yes. I knew Colin when I came down here and was at Ashburn Hall and was friendly with Rodney Kennedy. I went there a great deal to Rodney's, and Rodney came here. And for many, many years, 20 years, I met all those people, like Toss Wollaston and Colin and all those people. And I got to know Colin very well.
What is it about Colin's life and work that interested you particularly?
I think it's the land. Because what he did really and truly was, he had a great feeling for the land, you know, all those hills at Oamaru and all of it. Of course, there were the people in the land too, but somehow that the land was a part of us, you know, we're part of the land.
Yes.
And he had a great feeling for that very much, I think.
Your own paintings are full of people, mainly women, and often in landscape. Have you got anything to say about that?
They're mainly women. Every now and again I've put men in, but on the whole, you see, my father died when I was 10 and I was brought up by women, and I seem to have always lived with my aunts and women, and had men too, but mainly now it seems as if it's women. And I just have to make do with the women and the children. Occasionally a man gets in.
Yes.
I wish they would.
Well, you've got one or two young people in as well, but
Yeah.
are the people in your paintings, they seem to be recollecting things.
I think
Are
so.
they your recollections of your aunts and so
Yes,
on?
I think so. I think that a lot of those people, nearly everybody that I paint, always, I'm really saying the thoughts, the things that they're thinking about, what they're feeling.
Yes.
It's all to do with feeling.
They're often quiet, or they seem to me quiet and wry. They almost seem as if they're actually scrutinising us in a way. Do you feel?
I think that is that a good lot. I think it was all to do with that most of my work's been done when I've got older and had been not well, and that, so that it's more as an onlooker, really.
For Pat, art and literature are close companions. She often puts quotations from T.S. Eliot on the back of her paintings, and she frequently listens to tapes of poetry and novels while she paints. Pat says books, and particularly her favourite authors, Forster, Eliot and Chekhov, give her security and comfort. As her eyesight's failed, in recent years talking books and records have assumed greater importance for her. It's common to find her at work on a painting or resting while listening to Eliot reading from his 4 quartets. Pat says she likes writing that's full of pathos and nostalgia, and confesses that Russian stories, especially those of Chekhov, are closest to her heart. They are, she says, so romantic and sad. When one examines Pat France's work, her love of Chekhov is imperishably clear. It's the Chekhov who remarked somewhere that, in order to live in the present, we have to atone for the past. You paint in oils from the beginning, or did you do gouaches?
I painted gouache, always gouache to begin with, watercolour, then gouache, a lot of gouache. But of late years I've gone into the oil. And the oil I find easier because you can blot it out.
Did you do a lot of blotting out?
Yes, quite a bit. Sometimes I might work on it for days and think I've got it right, and then I suddenly look at it and think it's no good at all, and I blot it out. But I don't very often have to blot out the whole lot.
Sometimes you've said to me, oh, I'm sick of it, or I'm tired of it. But you do keep going back to the paintings.
Occasionally, not very often do I blot them out entirely, but I do sometimes.
Yeah.
And sometimes I feel I'd like to take them and bash them through the window.
I can't imagine you actually stopping painting unless you had to. Can you?
I can't see much now, but I still go on splashing it on. It is a freedom. I think it's a freedom really from your past, your anxieties, and I don't really quite, I think it's just to express how you feel.
You've got something written there which I think you said to me once,
Well,
sort of sums up a lot of what...
Yes, someone,
painting is about.
I copied this out from somewhere, and I think that this is, I think we all do this, whatever form of creativity we're doing, but it was painting out the years of learning and acceptance towards a measure of freedom.
Yes.
Now, I think that is true, that if you feel that if you've done something, you've more or less, you've painted it out, you have released yourself up to a point. You've said what you wished, or you hope you've said a bit.